Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to our webinar, Protecting Donor Intent in Higher Education Grant-Making. My name is Joanne Florino. I'm the Adam Meyerson Fellow at the Philanthropy Roundtable, and I want to thank you all for joining us today. So earlier this year, the Philanthropy Roundtable published an updated guidebook on protecting donor intent, in which a full chapter was devoted to giving wisely to colleges and universities. Although it's a popular area of grant making for many donors, higher education is also the most challenging area for donor intent and grant compliance. In higher ed, donors' memory of their alma mater and their loyalty to their alma mater can take precedence over good due diligence, and where the complexity of gifts can make them more vulnerable to what I call creative interpretation, if not direct violation. For today's discussion, I'm fortunate to be joined by three individuals who can speak to donor intent through both knowledge and personal experience. Jeff Moritz will tell us how Ohio State University has failed to fulfill the terms of a $30 million gift made by his late father, Michael Moritz. He is joined by his counsel, David Marburger of Marburger Law, LLC, who is also a former law firm colleague of Michael Moritz, and he will discuss the legal aspects of the case. And finally, Emily Koons Jae from the American Council of Trustees and Alumni's Fund for Academic Renewal will walk us through some of the ways higher education donors can help ensure that their donations remain true to their original intent. Please ask questions through the Q&A box at the bottom of your screen. You will find in the chat box, also at the bottom of your screen, links to the Roundtable's Donor Intent Guide and to ACTA's updated Intelligent Donor's Guide to College Giving. So let's get started. Jeff, can you start us off by telling us about your father, about his gift, and about the sequence of events that led to your discovery that Ohio State was not fulfilling the gift terms?
Yes, and thank you very much for having me on this webinar. My father grew up, his family was not very wealthy. He had to pay for his undergraduate degree. And when he was looking at applying to law schools, financing law school and paying for the tuition was a big deal for him. And Ohio State came to him and said that they would offer him a full ride scholarship if he came to the law school at Ohio State. And that was the reason for him attending law school at Ohio State. So when he later in life had the ability to make a gift back to his law school, giving other needy students the opportunity to attend law school that maybe otherwise couldn't afford it was extremely important to him. He wanted to give the same students as he was that opportunity. And so the gift was $30 million, as you mentioned, and a third of it went to 4 endowed professorships, and a third of it went to a dean's innovation fund, and a third of it was to fund 30 full ride scholarships to the university every single year. And Ohio State in the endowment contract actually states that they will commit to giving 30 scholarships a year. So he passed away shortly after the gift was made, 9 months, but he did get to meet the first class of scholars, and that was, meeting them and hearing their stories. I will remember for the rest of my life that was extremely important to him. So fast forward to 2016, my mom got a report from Ohio State which showed the $30 million gift over that 15-year period had declined to under 22 million. So almost a third of the endowment was gone. And that was disturbing to me and my mom. And so we asked Ohio State, exactly what was going on. And it took a lot of effort and time to really figure out what exactly had happened. And, and as it turned out, they had never given 30 scholarships in any year, not even in the first year. They failed to give the scholarships that they committed to do. And in asking questions about, the value of the fund, it turned out that they were taking an annual fee out of of the fund, which turns out it goes to pay for a lot of different things, primarily to pay for salaries and paying for banquets and parties and travel expenses for them to go out and wine and dine other wealthy people. And it has nothing to do with the law school. It has nothing to do with the purpose of my father's gift. It's just money taken out every single year to really pay for a slush fund that they can use however they want. It's not just development. I mean, they pay for credit card fees. It's, you know, special projects around the university. It's just an open fund for them to take these monies out. So our family's fear was this $30 million was being spent down to zero. And it was only a matter of time before that happened. So we immediately went and said, we need to stop this from happening. And were met with a lot of resistance from the university. They say that, the first thing was, well, your endowment contract provides for this. Well, we read the endowment contract and nowhere does it provide for a development fee. Then they said the Ohio Attorney General has authorized us to take this fee and is opined that it's perfectly legal. Well, we reached out to the Attorney General's office and, they said we didn't do that. And then they said, well, the Board of Trustees has authorized us to take this fee. And we were like, well, they can't supersede a contract, can they? And then they said, well, only the Attorney General can enforce gift agreements in the state of Ohio. So, it was a lot of runaround, a lot of, misinformation or what have you. And we finally decided that, since my father was the only signer to this endowment contract, the only way to really be in a position to negotiate with Ohio State was to try and reopen his estate and appoint me as administrator to help negotiate with that. So we filed in the probate court to reopen my father's estate, and almost immediately Ohio State jumped in and in effect sued us to stop the process, to stop us from reopening the estate. And we were, been in litigation with them for at least 3 years. And they have done everything legally possible to stop us from reopening the estate and having us the ability to just to negotiate with them. We haven't threatened to sue anyone. And in the meantime, we found out that this isn't happening to just my father's restricted fund. They are taking this fee out of every single restricted fund at the university. And not only that, they're taking out $19 million a year from these funds. And in further research, we found that over 2,000 of restricted funds at Ohio State are underwater in the same way that my father's is. So they're spending their endowment, the principal of these endowment funds, just as fast as they're spending my father's. And this was just startling to us. And, it was just disturbing too, that they're suing us. The reason they're suing us or preventing us from just reopening my father's estate is because they don't want this to come out, to the fact that they are doing this to all these scholarship funds. They don't want donors to know exactly what is going on. And so we also realized that we needed to get this out there. And so we started what we call an honor-bound initiative, which is an effort for us to publicize exactly what is happening at Ohio State with their endowment funds, how they're handling the administration of these funds, and the fees that they're taking out, and where those are going. And to educate donors, to let donors know that they should inquire about their own funds. And then in further research, we found out that it's not just Ohio State, but other universities in Ohio, for sure, Miami University, Ohio University, they're doing the exact same thing to their funds. And it's just mind-boggling that the students who are are being harmed by this, are not, up in arms as well. Not only donors, but the students, the beneficiaries of all these scholarship funds, uh, aren't standing up and preventing these universities from spending scholarship funds on whining and dining wealthy potential donors. So that's that's sort of how we've got to this point, Joanne.
Jeff, tell them what you discovered when we revealed that certain other restricted endowments are underwater. What did you discover on the OSU website?
Well, OSU had a part of their website where donors can go in and they can type in their fund, and anyone can really type in any fund. So if you want to see a scholarship fund for the vet school or for the business school, what all the scholarships are and the funds and the market values of those funds and what the purpose is, you could go on Ohio State's website and just type that in. It was information. Well, as soon as we started publicizing that all these funds were 10, 30% underwater, Ohio State immediately shut down the website so that no one else, let alone the donor, could find out their information. I mean, what does that tell you?
Quite a bit, quite a bit. And I do want to say that I know that this is happening outside of Ohio because we've had folks tell us, or explain very similar cases to us. But I really do want to thank you. And I also want to add one thing, or I'm going to ask you to add it. For whom is the law school at Ohio State named, Jeff?
Well, it's named after my father. It's the Michael E. Moritz College of Law at Ohio State.
Okay. So I think there's a little insult to injury there. But in any case, I do want to
also, Joanne, one of the endowed professorships is actually an endowed professorship for dispute resolution, alternative dispute resolution. So how ironic is it that he funded this chair of this department to study, mediation and dispute resolution, but Ohio State then sues his family to stop them from actually getting resolution of an issue. I mean, is that crazy?
Well, this is why we're talking about this today, and I appreciate the frustration and sorrow that your family must feel about what's happened to that endowment fund. I do want to turn now to David, though, and David, I obviously Jeff has mentioned the legal proceedings that have taken place, but I'd like you to walk us with a little more detail through the legal aspects of the case. And thank you so much, Jeff.
Sure, but before I do that, I wanted to acquaint you with an unconventional in the world of philanthropy legal analysis that I did in the case, and that corrects some of the assumptions that we make that you make in your world of philanthropy, and that is these are gifts under federal tax law, but they're not really gifts. What they really are is a contract that we're going to call them donors, even though I don't believe they are donors, not in the fullest sense. These are contracts between the donor and the institution. Contracts they normally would be enforceable by the institution if the donor breached, or normally enforceable by the donor if the institution breached. Now, the gift part of it is, at least when you're giving scholarships or faculty chairs, the recipients of those scholarships and faculty chairs, they are getting a gift. And that gift is coming from the donor. And only in that sense are these gifts. These are contracts between the charitable institution, which makes commitments to the donor in exchange for the donor providing the money. And these are written contracts, and these are not conditions of gifts. These are contracts. And Mr. Moritz's contract with Ohio State is no gift. It's a contract. The gift is the recipients of the Moritz scholarships and the recipients of the faculty chairs that the contract provides for, but Ohio State University is not getting a gift. The gift is going to those other people. Ohio State University is making a legal commitment, and this is another way I deviate from your language, your lexicon. I don't buy this donor intent. It's a legal commitment by the university to the donor. Donor intent is too fuzzy, too uncertain, too generalized. We're talking about firm, enforceable legal commitments. So what really is happening is that the charitable institution is making a legal commitment to donors and they violate them. Something needs to be done about that. And we tried to do something about it. And our problem was, in the Moritz matter, was that Jeff Moritz and his mom were not parties, were not signatories. They did not sign an endowment agreement with Ohio State University. Only Michael Moritz signed it. So if you want to enforce that contract, you've got to be Michael Moritz, but he was dead. So how do you enforce that contract? Because no one can enforce it except the people who sign it. So we decided, let's try to reopen Michael Moritz's estate, have Jeff Moritz be the administrator of the estate, and while we believed we could try to negotiate from that position, and I should let me preface this. When Jeff and his mother tried informally to resolve this problem, one of the unfortunate pieces of feedback they got is, well, you aren't parties to the endowment agreement. You don't really have any say in whether we comply with our commitments to your father, Ohio State said. And so our view was, okay, we're going to make ourselves parties. And the way you make yourself a party is you reopen Michael's estate. You're not actually a party. You reopen Michael's estate, you become the administrator for his estate, and now as administrator, you should be able to enforce his contract with Ohio State. Ohio State fought to the nail to stop us from reopening the estate, made a lot of arguments that I believed were invalid. And however, ultimately, the success in the case was not ours. That is because the Attorney General also, the Ohio Attorney General also jumped in when Ohio State didn't. We sued nobody. We sued nobody. When you try to reopen an estate, you don't name an adversary. You have no opponent. It's largely a ministerial undertaking where the probate court has the discretion to reopen the estate. And when you are doing what we're doing, we're asserting a newly discovered legal claim. And that legal claim was breach of contract. Jeff discovered it. Nobody knew that Ohio State was not providing 30 scholarships every year, as it had committed to do. Jeff discovered it in 2016, when now we had a claim for relief against Ohio State. Not that we were going to seek damages, not that we were going to try to return money to the estate and distribute it to the family. We wanted to enforce the commitment, the charitable commitment that Ohio State made and violated. And that is an appropriate role for an estate, to enforce a commitment made to the donor that's been violated. So what ultimately happened was that the Attorney General in Ohio State said to the probate court, don't reopen the estate. Don't reopen the estate because only the Attorney General can enforce an endowment agreement with Ohio State. And we said, well, wait a minute. We're just trying to reopen the estate. We don't have a proposed complaint here. We don't have a complaint that a judge could review and determine the validity of it. All we want to do is reopen the estate. And then if things go south in negotiations with Ohio State, which ultimately they will, we know this after 3 years, ultimately they will go south. Then, yeah, we might then sue. But if we sued, it won't be in the probate court. We'd sue Ohio State in a court that isn't a specialty court, but a general court. And the judge in the general court would decide who has standing to enforce the endowment agreement. And they'd have a complaint in front of them. They'd be able to evaluate the validity of the complaint. And that judge ultimately would be the true decider of who has standing. But we never could get that far, because although we argued that the probate court has no jurisdiction to decide in advance the outcome of a lawsuit that isn't before it, that would be before a different court, the probate court said, no, we're going to decide that, and we're going to decide that only the Attorney General can enforce an endowment agreement, even though there's no complaint before us and no lawsuit before us. And we said that violates Ohio's Constitution, which requires, it's like in the federal courts where you have to have a case or controversy, you have to have a live lawsuit. There's no live lawsuit. And the probate court said, we're deciding this anyway. So we appealed and we said, the probate court had no business reaching out. This is supposedly a conservative Republican court, which famously say that they're against judicial legislation. They're against judges reaching out to decide more than they have to. The probate court was reaching out to decide way more than it had to. And so we argued to the Court of Appeals that very thing, that you should not reach this. It's not justiciable at this point. It's grossly premature. But the probate court, the Court of Appeals went ahead and agreed with the probate court. The Court of Appeals would not force the probate court to reopen Michael's estate. And B, the ground for doing that in part was because only the Attorney General can enforce an endowment agreement, even though there was no lawsuit to do that before the Court of Appeals. I thought what the Court of Appeals did was unjustifiable. I thought it was laughably wrong, completely invalid, but that's what happened. And so that's where we were. We lost that case within the last month. And I'll tell you what, we have a great argument as to why the Attorney General is not the mandatory surrogate for the donor in these endowment agreement cases. And if there's somebody out there that has a breached endowment agreement and wants justice, call us, because we want to help you.
Well, thank you, David. The passion that both you and Jeff have around this case is so obvious to our audience. I do want to say there is a couple of comments in Q&A. One is the reality that the courts do not recognize those gift agreements as contracts. They recognize them as irrevocable gifts. But we are hearing here from a living donor who has had a problem like this and had even specified an alternative use for the endowment in the gift agreement in case the original purpose was abandoned, and is still having a problem having that case resolved. So I think we've clearly opened a door here, and I suspect that after your comments and Jeff's comments, a lot of people are going to be checking the current reports on their endowments to see exactly where they are. And I do appreciate the frustration, but what we have typically found, and I think Emily will speak to this, is that these agreements, unless a contingent beneficiary is named who will have standing because there's clearly a financial benefit at stake, it's very hard to have these enforced in courts of law, and that really is an issue. So I want to echo your invitation that if anyone has an issue in Ohio with enforcing a gift agreement, there's hope in that state. In some states that door is closed. I believe that's the case. But I do want to also say something else. This is not a case. We often talk about the things a donor could have done differently or the mistakes a donor made. This is not that case. This was a gift agreement that was carefully written out, that clearly had obligations on both sides. One side was putting in the money. The specifications about how the money was to be used were clear. And it does, I think, say something about the danger of endowment gifts in general in higher education and elsewhere. It's something we talk about, and yet I understand that especially for very large projects in higher education, endowments are often favored. I want to remind people again to go to the Q&A if they have questions, and I think we'll move on. David, I suspect you're going to have more to say later, but I do want to pass things now to Emily. Emily, I know you deal with many cases, not exactly like this one, but with donors who have been, who feel betrayed in the case of donor intent in college giving. And I think the audience would appreciate hearing from you about your reaction to this case in particular, and also some general points of advice for higher education donors. So thank you again, David.
Well, thank you so much, Joanne, and thank you so much to the Roundtable for hosting today's discussion. I think it's a vitally important topic, and David and Jeff, thank you so much for sharing your story. I think it's one that every higher education donor really needs to hear. So I'm director of the Fund for Academic Renewal, which is a project of the American Council of Trustees and Alumni. And the entire reason that we exist is because higher education giving is such a challenge. We work with donors to guide them through the giving process and ensure that their gifts reflect their vision and their values and that their intent is protected. And one point before I begin is that I hope that none of this discourages you from giving to higher education. It's certainly a challenging area to give, but is also can be incredibly rewarding. It's where the big ideas are formed that shape our society. You can really make a difference in the lives and learning of students. So even though it is challenging, it is well worth doing. So I think it can be easy to be frustrated or disappointed by the direction that higher education is going, but donors can make a really big difference. They can revitalize our institutions of higher learning. So I'd encourage you to think about being part of the solution and not walking away from higher education. So I wanted to talk about 3 pillars to protect your intent. And I'm stealing this liberally from the guidebook that we just published at ACTA. It's the Intelligent Donor's Guide to College Giving. I think that there's a link in the chat box, but I'd be glad to send you copies of that as well if you reach out to me after this webinar. And as well from Joanne's excellent book, as she mentioned, an entire chapter is devoted to higher education giving. So really encourage you to read that as well. So those pillars are to know the purpose behind your giving, to build partnerships on campus, and then finally to write a really, really good gift agreement and ensure that you get as much help as you can in that process. So first, knowing your purpose, which is common sense, but it bears repeating. Be sure that you go in knowing what it is that you want to achieve through your gift. Understand what matters to you and where you're open to compromise. And there's no right or wrong answer here. I mean, I want my name on that building is a perfectly valid reason to make a gift, and that'll shape your experience in a much different way than I want to endow a chair on a particular topic. We helped one donor make a gift to his alma mater, which was the Citadel, a military academy in South Carolina. And many of his fellow alums go into the world of public service. He entered the world of business and credited his strong accounting background for the success that he enjoyed in his career. And when he wanted to give back, it was really important to him that he endow a chair, but he also wanted to endow a chair in accounting held by somebody with recent relevant experience in the world of business, which presents a challenge because usually an endowed chair is held for decades. So we worked with him to structure a gift that was a visiting, rotating professorship. So somebody would hold this chair for 3 years, be involved in choosing their successor, and then someone new would hold that chair for 3 years. So by thinking creatively, he was able to achieve his purpose in that gift. If he'd gone the traditional route, I don't think he would have been nearly as happy with the outcome. And then the second pillar to protecting your intent is to build really strong partnerships on campus, and partnerships in the plural sense. If you're only talking to the development office, you're not going to get the full picture of what's happening on campus. And that's not a slight against people in the development profession. They play a really important role in guiding donors through that giving process. But you also want to meet the people who are going to be responsible for executing your gift. So if you're making a gift to the athletics program, certainly meet the coaches and the staff. If you're making a gift that's academic in nature, you really need to meet the faculty. And I'm a bit biased here. I'm the daughter of a professor. I think they're just wonderful people to get to know in general. But for those academic gifts, you really need to know the people who will be teaching students. And finding a professor who shares your vision is really one of the surest guarantees of your intent. We've seen some really wonderful campus centers develop out of these partnerships between donors and faculty. We have a few great examples in our guidebook. There's the Furman, the Tocqueville Forum at Furman University, which was started by Sandy and Ginny McNeil, the Stephen Smith Center at Xavier University, a number of these academic centers. And by working with faculty, you really have an ally who's fully committed to your vision on campus. There are a number of organizations that can help you find these faculty friends. There's the Jack Miller Center if you're interested in the world of constitutional studies, American history. IHS is a great option for those interested in economics. ACTA, of course, interested in the liberal arts more generally. And the third pillar is to have a really strong gift agreement and get all the help that you can in writing that gift agreement. So once you have that clear understanding of your purpose, you've built those on-campus partnerships, it's not the moment to send in your check. You want to work carefully with the university to craft an airtight gift agreement that secures your intent. This is really your insurance policy. The hope is that it can sit in a file cabinet. You never need to pull it out. But if you do, you need to make sure that this document really encapsulates your intent. and puts you and your representative in the best position possible to defend this gift. So never take the template the university gives you and simply sign on the dotted line. Really want to encourage you to get your own legal representation or to modify that template quite a bit to get the outcome that you want. One service that FAR can offer that donors have found really helpful, we work with Andras Casares of Arnold and Porter here in DC. And thanks to the generosity of our funder, the Dave Spencer Foundation, Andras can review a gift agreement free of charge. We'll walk through, make recommendations, point out any areas that need strengthening. So really would encourage you to take advantage of this. There's no reason not to. It's quick, it's easy, and it's free. A few things to consider putting in your gift agreement, and Joanne's book covers this in great detail on page 119, chapter 7. So I encourage you to think about putting a statement of purpose into your gift agreement, especially if you have a gift that will extend beyond your lifetime. This can be a really nice way to capture your biography, why it is that you're giving. Having this in writing can really help to codify your vision and your purpose. I would also encourage you to spell out reporting requirements. So who do you want to receive reports? How often? What should those reports include? And I would encourage you to think about having reports sent to a third party in addition to yourself, which sends a strong signal to the university that somebody else is looking out for this gift as well. Never waive your right to cypre. So if you see any language within that gift agreement that says empowering the Board of Trustees, in the event that your gift is impractical to carry out, to make modifications, just take a marker and strike that right out. You absolutely do not want that in the gift agreement. And also think through a contingency plan if the university does not honor your intent, and make sure that that's spelled out in detail in the gift agreement. So we helped the Pizzagalli Family Foundation put together a gift agreement with the University of Vermont, and this is an example that Joanne includes in her book. And one clause we helped to implement was a clawback provision. So it outlines what happens if the university does not fill the chair in the way that they've agreed to within the time frame that they agreed to. And what happens is that the gift will then revert from the university foundation back to the Pizzagalli Family Foundation. And having this in writing is really important. It provides a strong incentive for the university to do the right thing. And if this ever were to go to court, it would put the Pizzagalli family in a very good position. And certainly don't be afraid to ask questions throughout the gift agreement process, especially if there's a provision that's unclear. And after today's discussion, I certainly hope you will ask about fees being charged to your gift. This is something that's happening widely, but very few donors know about it. So really want to thank Jeff and David for sharing this story, because I think every donor needs to be asking about fees. And finally, I want to encourage you to seek help from other sources. So there are organizations out there who exist just to help you. I mean, the Philanthropy Roundtable is an unparalleled resource for donors. Certainly go to them for help. ACTA would be glad to help you through FAR. And then ask other donors who have been through the process about what they would recommend, what their experience was. We interviewed one of our board members, John Altman, about his own giving experience. And what he said is that each iteration of his philanthropy, he gets a little bit smarter. So his first gift just got him really good tickets to the football game. But his most recent gift, he was able to establish the John W. Altman Institute for Entrepreneurship, in which he's deeply invested. Personally, he's found this giving very meaningful. So to include, please consider making gift to higher education despite the dangers. I think go in with eyes wide open to what those can be, but it can be a really rewarding area of giving. But think carefully about your purpose, build those on-campus partnerships, and really seek help writing an excellent gift agreement.
Thank you, Emily. I think that captures a lot of chapter 7 in the Roundtable Donor Intent Guidebook. In passing, I talked about a contingent beneficiary, and many of you may have read this year about a legal dispute between Hillsdale College and the University of Missouri, in which Hillsdale College had been named a contingent beneficiary by a gentleman named Sherlock Hibbs, who had made a gift to the University of Missouri. I'm not going to go into the details, but had been very clear that Hillsdale College was to get the reports on a regular basis. And because they were named a contingent beneficiary, if Missouri failed to honor the gift terms, Hillsdale College had standing in court. And there was legal action taken by Hillsdale College. There were negotiations. And a certain amount of money from the original gift was in fact sent by the University of Missouri to Hillsdale. I should say a little bit of trivia there is that Hillsdale actually hired a graduate of the University of Missouri to represent them in that case. So little politicking there, but that is definitely something to think about in these kinds of instances. We have gotten a couple of questions here. So I do want to turn to these, but again, thank you, Jeff and David and Emily. I think some of these questions will be specific to one of you. So here for David, someone is asking, would it be a different matter if the gift agreement was executed posthumously with the executors and co-trustees of the estate as the signatory?
In that instance, if I understand the question correctly, the estate or the administrator of the estate would file a lawsuit to enforce the endowment agreement. And they would file it, I would advise, not in the probate court, but in a general division court. And then you'll still have the issue of whether only the attorney general can enforce that agreement. But at least the issue would be squarely presented. You wouldn't have to reopen the estate first. The estate would, the contract would in effect be part of the estate.
Okay.
I did want to add, if I may, about the irrevocable gift notion that you mentioned, Joanne. That's not universally the case. There are well-known, albeit few, cases that will treat these deals, which I call a deal, as not a gift, but an enforceable contract. And maybe the most famous one was by Judge Cardozo when he was the presiding judge in the New York Court of Appeals, which is the highest court in that state, in which he enforced as a contract an endowment agreement or a gift agreement between a resident of New York and Allegheny College in Pennsylvania, and he enforced it as a contract. And that was in like 1927. That was in 1927.
I think we know that donor intent is treated differently from state to state and from one attorney general to another. New York actually has a pretty good historic reputation for enforcing donor intent, not only on recipients in terms of the donor, but also on charities that attempt to change their own purpose and use gifts for other reasons, even in the absence of a living donor. But looking at, I guess that's one other thing that we should be talking about is think about the state that would, if it comes to that, enforce your gift agreement and try to do a little bit of research about how similar cases have or have not been treated there. I do want to get to some other questions here. This is a question about the assessment of a fee. Was a member of the fundraising staff serving as an investment manager, which might warrant a small fee? My experience is that universities pay investment managers independently to manage these endowments, and that might be an expected expense. I head up a family foundation now, but previously served as VP of development at a university. I'm aware of many universities assessing fees. Some are public about it, others not so much. I actually think that's the issue right there, is that if you're going to assess a fee, you would assume you have at least a moral, if not a legal obligation, to tell your endowment owners or their families that starting on X date, a fee is going to be assessed. But Jeff, I'm going to turn to you here. Were you and your mother ever notified about the imposition of a fee?
No, absolutely not. And it was, as I mentioned before, it took a long while before Ohio State actually acknowledged the fee. And even after that time, my mom would have development officers calling her and she would say, "Oh, I'm not comfortable giving any money given the development fee." And the officer would say, "There's no such thing as a development fee." Or they would say, "Oh, it's an investment management fee," which, you know, I know there was a question about this goes to the investment management fee. This is in Ohio State's case. This has nothing to do with investment management. The underlying managers who actually manage the investment of the money get paid, some other way. This is an administrative fee. It goes to in the case of Ohio State, it goes to lots of different things, mostly to development. It just pays for their development staff to go out and raise more money, which, it raises more money for the university, but it doesn't raise more money for my father's endowment. It goes to raise money for whatever, but it's mostly just wining and dining rich people. And they also have used it, as I mentioned, for paying credit card fees for something, or to a special project on campus. They need some money to fund this project. It's a really, there's no accountability for it, but it's definitely not for the investment management part of it, which would be a normal expense for an endowment to actually invest the money. So it really is. Donors really need to be very alert about these kinds of fees and push back against them.
Thank you. Emily, I'm going to direct this one to you. I find that university development departments often insist that donations be made as gifts rather than grants. The upshot of this is that the gift agreement contains lots of wiggle room for the university. For example, restricted purposes are expressed as donor wishes rather than binding restrictions. How should donors respond to this distinction?
There's different overhead amounts charged as well for gifts versus grants. So that's something to be aware of. I think this is a point to negotiate. I think if you can have your gift seen as a grant or have it categorized in that way, you certainly should. I think most donors aren't aware that there is a distinction between the two. So I think having that conversation is really important. And I would be surprised if they were unwilling to budge on this point. I think if you were really insistent that you want this categorized as a grant, my guess is that they're willing to work with you on that. But I think this is where knowing your purpose is so important. So be very clear on what it is that you're trying to achieve and make sure that this grant agreement, if you can categorize that way, is going to achieve all of those things that you're desiring.
So my experience from my foundation days is that philanthropic gifts were dealt with through the development office, and they were viewed as gifts. If it was a grant from the government, that was in grants and contracts. And that is the way the distinction is made at the university that I know best, is that, nothing that I did ever was dealt with in the grants and contracts office. Those government grants definitely get contract care and feeding. But on the development side, they definitely call them gifts. And Emily is correct about the way indirect costs are assessed as well. And in that matter, I would say that some foundations have successfully capped the amount that they will cover in indirect fees. And that often is another donor dispute that I think comes up from time to time. David, question for you. Will the Moritz matter go to the Ohio Supreme Court?
No. And the reason it won't is because the probate court and the Court of Appeals reached out to decide the issue of, reached out to rule that only the Attorney General can enforce an endowment agreement when we had no lawsuit to enforce the endowment agreement. The fact that the courts reached out to decide an issue that's not appropriately decided, in fact, in which they had no true jurisdiction to decide, makes us feel that that could happen in the Ohio Supreme Court. And if it did, it would create a precedent, an undeserved precedent, that would hurt other people who give, or you guys call it give, I call it contract, but who contract to provide money to institutions. We didn't want to risk a precedent that would impact people who were living and who had breached endowment agreements and wanted to sue to enforce those. We didn't want to take the chance of the court reaching out to decide that question that's not actually before it, as the courts already have done in our matter. So we decided we're not going to proceed any further. That isn't because we have any doubt at all in the strength of our legal position. It's because we don't want to take the risk of court doing something it shouldn't be doing, but which the courts below have already done.
Thank you. Thank you. Another question here. I understand universities are their own worst enemies, and this is common mode of operations for most large public and private university foundations. But have you seen this problem in other entities like community foundations or other ones I may not be thinking about now that hold scholarships? Well, just jump in there and say, yes, absolutely. That endowment gifts are troublesome around museums, around community foundations, around schools and hospitals. They are the easiest ones to manipulate often because they last beyond a living donor's lifetime. And if no one is keeping an eye on them, they are susceptible to all kinds of mischief. I will tell you that there are concerns right now about gifts of land and endowment gifts that have been given to the Boy Scouts of America because of the lawsuits that are currently being filed against BSA. And these gifts were irrevocable gifts of land. That land was meant to be held in perpetuity. Usually it houses a Boy Scout camp. And endowments often accompany those gifts as well for the care of that land, the upkeep of that land and the camp over a period of time. So I think that these matters often are not made public because it's better for a development office to negotiate rather than, have to have this all spilled out in public. Ohio State has been more stubborn than some of the development offices I know in their refusal to negotiate it all. But I think that endowment gifts, by their very nature, although they are popular and although institutions, both large and small, love to get them, are difficult. And so that leads me to talking a little bit about ways to also, Emily did such a great job, but ways to structure a long-term gift that is not an endowment. And there's quite a bit about this in the guidebook. I think universities, because of the complexity of many of the gifts that are made to universities, they are to fund scholarships over a long period of time, or to create a center that requires a great outlay of money up front. That universities definitely have a preference for those to be endowments. But there are ways that donors can structure very long-term gifts that can always be renewed for another term if everything is going satisfactorily, and try to and pay more upfront than you'll pay over a period of time so that the university does get that startup money. But that doesn't involve an endowment. I worked for one organization that just refused to make endowment gifts for exactly this reason. It was a limited life foundation. It did not want these gifts to extend beyond the lifetime of that institution. And so they were very careful about the way they made gifts. Often they would make the initial gift to a campaign so that the project could get started and wait for individuals or other institutional philanthropy to make the endowment gifts. So I think donors really need to think about this, and they need to think about the longevity of these gifts and what could happen in the future, and think carefully about ways to avoid the problems that we're seeing develop, not only at Ohio State, but at other institutions as well. Emily and I have both become aware of several Ivy League universities that have developed new gift policies that actually prevent a donor from adding a reversion clause of any kind to the gift agreement. So you should not sign any, you should not abide by those gift policies if you're a donor to either of these universities, who I will not name on this call, but if you want to know, just, email me at the roundtable. So I hope that we're leaving this, I want to leave it, again, it got a little upbeat. The last thing either Emily or I want to do is discourage donors from giving to higher education, especially donors who represent a more conservative point of view, donors who want to think about campus climate, donors who want to protect free speech on campus, your gifts are sorely needed at this point in time. But there are places you can go to get this great advice. Your own attorney may be helpful. You can definitely call on ACTA, on IHS, on the roundtable. We have worked on helping donors shape gift agreements in the past and will continue to do so. So do reach out and do speak with other donors. I think that's the other thing I would encourage you to do. We can, if you contact me, we can put you in touch with other donors in higher education who have figured out some of these thorny issues and who would be happy to share their solutions with you. So don't lose hope. I understand that if you have a long-term case and you're not getting satisfaction, it is very, very frustrating. When we wrote the guidebook this year, we really didn't want to tell all the horror stories and leave out the stories of success in protecting donor intent in higher education. And I think that if you look at the guidebook and if you look at the Intelligent Donors Guide to College Giving that ACTA has just put out, you're going to have just many, many examples of donors who have done their best to make these kinds of gifts work and actually continue to adhere to their original intent. But it's not an easy process. And I also want to stress what Emily said about relationships. The chances are good that that university that you're giving to is going to outlive you or your foundation. And even if that's not the case, the dean who is handling your gift today may not be the dean in 3 years or 5 years. In fact, it may not even be the dean next year. So you really need to make sure your relationships are solid in many different places, not just with the president's office, not just with the development office, not only with the faculty member who's going to lead your center to start, but have a real posse of supporters of what you want your gift to do that can be there even when you're gone. So I'm going to give everyone on the call here one last chance to make some closing remarks. I think we have about 7 minutes left. So let me start where we began with Jeff.
This has been a very interesting discussion, and I just want to highlight one thing because I know some of your listeners may be trustees of these universities and colleges, and I think we need to start seeing some leadership from the trustees on this issue. They're the ones who are in charge, and morally, ethically, and legally, they need to understand what is actually happening instead of just deferring to the staff to tell them what is going on and what is right. They really need to step up and show leadership. I know at Ohio State, it's mind-boggling to me that the Board of Trustees there are saying, let's sue the Moritz family. Let's spend hundreds of thousands of dollars to sue one of their largest donors so that they can enforce the gift agreement and we don't have to give the scholarships. And they're spending more money on legal fees to stop us from getting this out there than it would cost to actually give the scholarships to the students in the first place. I just find who on the Board of Trustees actually thinks that is good policy and good for the university. And so all these universities that are having these issues with donors, why aren't the trustees stepping in and saying, let's fix this, let's do the right thing, let's do what these donors wanted when we accepted their money, and let's the leadership really, it needs to start with the trustees. And I just think that message has to go out to them as well.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Jeff, for that. Last call for questions in the Q&A box at the bottom of your screen. And I want to turn to David. Final remarks, David.
When you enter into these endowment agreements and you're probably pretty emotional and you're thrilled to be able to provide your help to your alma mater, you assume that your alma mater won't violate the agreement. don't make that assumption. In any other element of your business, you wouldn't make that assumption. You have to provide for what happens if the institution violates. I will tell you this: if you violate your end of it, the institution will sue you. There are tons of cases where that has happened, where somebody pledges $30 million to be provided in 20 days and it doesn't happen. The universities sue that person for breach. Well, you know, if the universities can sue you, you ought to be putting yourself in a position that you can enforce the commitment the university makes to you. And you should not assume that the university will not breach that commitment. You should assume that the commitment might be breached. And you need to take the kinds of steps that Joanne and Emily have described to try to soften that blow.
Thank you, David. So Emily, your name's been called out. So last comments from you.
Sure. So first, I just think it's so disappointing the way that the Ohio State has treated the Moritz family. I think this was a wonderful act of generosity, and it's so unfortunate to hear stories like this, and so unfortunate that the responsibility does fall to donors to really educate themselves on the process and be sure that they're doing all that they can to protect their intent. And wanted to echo one point that you made, Joanne, about the danger of endowment agreements, and that is certainly endowment gifts, which is certainly true. So anytime that you can structure a gift where it's a year-by-year payment, or every 5 years where there's a renewal in place, it's much easier to stop renewing a gift than it is to pull the gift back from the university. So something to keep in mind as a parting thought.
Thank you, Emily. Okay, well, I don't believe there are any more questions. I'm going to check one last time. No, there are not. I want to thank our speakers today. You have been wonderful. I know this is not an easy topic, especially for you, Jeff. And I want to echo what Emily said about how disappointing it is that a university, which was the recipient of so much generosity and loyalty from a family, is not responding in a way that we would hope they would respond. I also want to echo, Jeff, what you said about trustees. I think that there should be a mechanism there for making sure that this behavior does not continue. And I see, it sounds like someone had a question that maybe I missed. Let me go back up here and check. Nope, I don't see it. Okay. But on that note, I do want to say that if you want to ask any more questions about this topic, certainly you can contact me at the Philanthropy Run. Oh, okay, got one here. Someone has raised their hand. I don't think I can actually. Okay, here we are. Is it true that a charitable institution, a university, can sue a donor? Yikes, examples, please. David?
Yeah, one of the examples is the case I mentioned, Judge Cardozo's case. Allegheny College was the plaintiff. In Ohio, there are several cases where universities or colleges sued the donor because the donor didn't satisfy the commitment to provide them the promised funds. And they do it under a theory of contract.
I will say that there was an incident like that here where I live, major university, where the university chose not to sue because, frankly, the bad public relations weigh any amount of money coming into the university. So, and I really don't want to end on a sour note like that. So I want to thank everyone so much for being with us. Our time is up. If you have any questions, please contact me at the Roundtable or Emily at ACTA. Thank you again, Jeff and David, for sharing this case with our audience. I wish you all the best and a happy Thanksgiving. Thank you again.